Hello and welcome to my channel again. And now today we will delve into a comprehensive exploration of motor control, breaking down the complexities into simple language to make it easily understandable. First we'll talk about understanding the motor control, means coordinating movements with the brain. Motor control is the process by which the brain and nervous system coordinate voluntary and involuntary movements of the body. From the simplest actions like blinking and breathing to complex tasks such as walking and writing, motor control is essential for our ability to interact with the world around us. This intricate process involves various brain regions, neural pathways, and feedback mechanisms working together seamlessly to produce smooth and coordinated movements. First, we'll talk about anatomy of motor control. The control of movement involves several key structures within the brain and spinal cord. First is primary motor cortex. Located in the frontal lobe of the brain, the primary motor cortex is responsible for initiating and executing voluntary movements. It contains specialized neurons called pyramidal cells that send signals to the muscles, instructing them to contract and produce movements. Second is basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are a group of interconnected nuclei located deep within the brain. They play a crucial role in regulating voluntary movements by modulating motor commands from the cortex and refining movement patterns. Dysfunction of the basal ganglia can lead to movement disorders such as Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. Next is cerebellum. The cerebellum, situated at the back of the brain, is involved in coordinating and fine-tuning movements. It receives inputs from the motor cortex and sensory systems and integrates this information to ensure smooth and accurate motor performance. Damage to the cerebellum can result in ataxia, a condition characterized by impaired coordination and balance. Next is brainstem. The brainstem, located at the base of the brain, contains several structures involved in motor control, including the medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain. These regions help regulate basic motor functions such as posture, balance, and reflexes. Next is spinal cord. The spinal cord serves as a conduit for motor signal traveling between the brain and the rest of the body. It contains motor neurons that transmit commands from the brain to the muscles, as well as sensory neurons that relay feedback information from the body to the brain. Second is voluntary versus involuntary movements. Motor control encompasses both voluntary and involuntary movements. First is voluntary movements. Voluntary movements are consciously initiated and controlled by the individual. They involve the activation of the primary motor cortex and other cortical regions responsible for planning and executing specific actions. Examples of voluntary movements include reaching, grasping, and speaking. Next is involuntary movements. Involuntary movements occurs without conscious efforts and are often automatic or reflexive in nature. They are mediated by subcortical structures such as the basal ganglia and brainstem, as well as spinal reflex circuits. Examples of involuntary movements include reflexes like the knee-jerk reflex, and automatic functions like breathing and heart rate regulation. Third is neural pathways in motor control. Motor control relies on specialized neural pathways that transmit signals between the brain and muscles. First is corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tract is the primary pathway for transmitting voluntary motor commands from the cortex to the spinal cord. It originates in the primary motor cortex and descends through the brain stem before synapsing on motor neurons in the spinal cord. Damage to the corticospinal tract can result in weakness or paralysis on the contralateral side of the body. Next is extrapyramidal system. The extrapyramidal system consists of neural pathways that regulate involuntary motor functions, including posture, balance, and automatic movements. It includes structures such as the basal ganglia and brainstem nuclei and helps modulate motor commands from the cortex to ensure smooth and coordinated movements. Next is cerebellar pathways. The cerebellum communicates with the motor cortex and spinal cord through specialized pathways known as the cerebellar peduncles. These pathways relay sensory and motor information to the cerebellum and facilitate motor learning, coordination, and error corrections. Next, fourth is feedback mechanisms in motor control. Motor control relies on sensory feedback to monitor and adjust movement performances. We will first talk about proprioception. Proprioception refers to the sense of body position and movement. Specialized receptors called proprioceptors detect changes in muscle length, tension, and joint position and provide feedback to the brain about the body's spatial orientation and movement dynamics. Next is sensory feedback loops. Sensory feedback loops involving pathways such as the spinal reflex arc and cerebral feedback circuits enable the brain to monitor ongoing movements and make real-time adjustment to ensure accuracy and precision. For example, when you step on an uneven surface, sensory feedback from the feet and legs triggers reflexive adjustment in posture and balance to prevent falls. Fifth is motor learning and plasticity. Motor control is a dynamic process that involves learning and adaptation over time. In that, first we'll talk about motor learning. Motor learning refers to the acquisition of new motor skills through practice and experience. It involves changes in neural connectivity and synaptic strength within motor circuits, as well as the refinement of movement patterns through trial and error. Next is neural plasticity. Neural plasticity is the brain's ability to reorganize and adapt in response to experience and environmental input. Motor learning is facilitated by neural plasticity mechanisms, including synaptic plasticity, dendritic remodeling, and changes in the cortical map representations. These mechanisms allow the brain to optimize motor performances and refine motor skills over time. Sixth is disorders of motor control. Disorders affecting motor control can have profound effects on the movement and mobility. In that, first we'll talk about movement disorders. Movement disorders are conditions characterized by abnormal or involuntary movements such as tremors, dystonia, and dyskinesia. These disorders can result from dysfunction in motor control circuits, neurotransmitter imbalances, or structural abnormalities in the brain. Second is neurological injuries. Traumatic brain injury, stroke, spinal cord injury, and neurodegenerative diseases can disrupt motor control pathways and impair movement. Depending on the location and the severity of the injury, individuals may experience weakness, paralysis, spasticity, or the loss of coordination. Third is developmental disorders. Developmental disorders such as cerebral palsy and developmental coordination disorder can affect motor development and coordination in children. Early intervention and therapeutic interventions can help improve motor skills and functional outcomes in affected individuals. So, in summary, motor control is a complex and dynamic process involving the coordination of voluntary and involuntary movements by the brain and nervous system. From the initiation of movement commands in the cortex to the execution of precise motor actions by the muscles, motor control relies on intricate neural pathways, feedback mechanisms, and adaptive processes. Understanding the mechanism of motor control can provide insights into normal movement behavior as well as the underlying mechanisms of movement disorders and neurological injuries. By studying motor control, researchers and clinicians can develop interventions to improve movements, function, enhance rehabilitation outcomes, and optimize motor performances in various contexts. So let us talk about voluntary movements and involuntary movements. So voluntary movements are actions that we consciously initiate and control. These movements are under our direct command and are executed with intention. Examples of voluntary movements include reaching for an object, typing on a keyboard, or kicking a ball. Here's a breakdown of how voluntary movements occur. First is cortical control. Voluntary movements are primarily initiated and controlled by the cerebral cortex, particularly the primary motor cortex located in the frontal lobe of the brain. The primary motor cortex contains specialized neurons called pyramidal cells that send signals known as motor commands to the muscles to generate the movements. Second is planning and execution. Before executing a voluntary movement, the brain engages in motor planning, a process that involves selecting and organizing a sequence of muscle contractions required to achieve the desired action. Motor planning occurs in cortical areas responsible for higher order cognitive functions such as the prefrontal cortex and premotor cortex. Next is initiation of movement. Once the motor plan is established, the primary motor cortex sends motor commands to the appropriate muscles via the corticospinal tract, a pathway that connects the cortex to the spinal cord. These commands activate the muscles, causing them to contract and produce movement. Next is feedback and adjustment. During voluntary movements, the brain continuously monitors sensory feedback from the body to ensure that the movement is accurate and well coordinated. Feedback mechanisms such as proprioception and vision provide information about the position, velocity, and force of the moving body parts. Based on this feedback, the brain can make real-time adjustments to the movements to maintain accuracy and precision. Next is conscious awareness. Voluntary movements are associated with the subjective sense of control and awareness. We are consciously aware of the movements we initiate and can modify them as needed based on our intentions and goals. Next is involuntary movements. In contrast to voluntary movements, involuntary movements occur without conscious effort or intention. These movements are often automatic or reflexive in nature and are regulated by neural circuits outside of conscious control. Examples of involuntary movements include reflexes such as the knee jerk reflex and automatic function like breathing and heart rate regulation. Here's how our involuntary movement occur. First is subcortical control. Involuntary movements are primarily mediated by subcortical structures including the brainstem, basal ganglia, and spinal cord. These regions contain neural circuits that generate and regulate automatic motor patterns without input from the cerebral cortex. Next is reflex arc. Reflexes are rapid, automatic responses to sensory stimuli that help protect the body and maintain homeostasis. They involve sensory receptors, sensory neurons, interneurons in the spinal cord or brain stem, and motor neurons that innervate the muscles. When a sensory stimulus is detected, such as tapping the knee with a reflex hammer, sensory information is relayed to the spinal cord where a reflex arc generates a quick motor response without conscious input from the brain. Automatic functions. In addition to reflexes, many bodily functions are controlled involuntarily by neural circuits in the brainstem and autonomic nervous system. For example, the brainstem regulates essential functions such as breathing, heart rate, and digestion to maintain physiological balance and ensure survival. These automatic functions operate continuously and unconsciously to support the life-sustaining processes. Next is limited conscious awareness. Unlike voluntary movements, involuntary movements are often performed without the conscious awareness or control. While we may become aware of certain involuntary movements, such as the sensation of breathing or the beating of the heart, we do not actively initiate or regulate these processes through conscious effort. Integration of voluntary and involuntary movements. Although voluntary and involuntary movements are distinct in terms of their initiation and control mechanisms, they are interconnected and often work together to produce coordinated actions. For example, voluntary movements may be modulated by involuntary reflexes to adapt to changes in the environment or maintain stability and balance. Involuntary movements such as postural adjustment and reflexive responses can support and enhance the execution of voluntary movements by providing stability and support. Both types of movements rely on sensory feedback mechanisms to monitor movement performance and adjust motor output accordingly. So, in summary, voluntary and involuntary movements represent two fundamental aspects of motor control, each with its own mechanisms and functions. While voluntary movements are consciously initiated and controlled by the cerebral cortex, involuntary movements occur automatically and are regulated by subcortical structures and reflex circuits. Despite their differences, voluntary and involuntary movements are integrated and coordinated to facilitate adaptive and purposeful actions in response to internal and external stimuli.